Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 9, 2023, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. Welcome back. Wanted to do a little bit of an update, and I apologize for anyone the 3 or 4 people that actually pay attention to the math. They will have seen some of this, but I have a point I want to try to make tonight, and I'm going to work on this over the next couple of weeks because I got to find a way to do this better, because apparently I'm not breaking through. And, you know, I tease a lot that this is a math-free zone, but I brought the boards to walk through the economic studies that basically show you can tax the rich and to get about 1.5% of GDP if you tax everything. And over here, when we're talking about doing cuts, we could probably get a point of GDP when you consider what? All non-defense discretionary might be 2.5% to 3% of GDP. So if the understanding saying, okay, so here's what we're talking about, cutting on our side, they're taxing on that side, you might get 3% of the economy. Since this fiscal year, so we're a little over 1/4 in this fiscal year, I think if you add up everything, we're borrowing about 9.6% of the economy. In the last 365 days, we borrowed 8.4% of the entire GDP. Does anyone see a math problem? And this is my frustration. The border, incredibly important. Getting these budget bills done, incredibly important. But the house is burning down around us. So one of the things we started about 6 weeks ago, and it has taken off, you can go to our website, sign up, and every single day I'm going to send you the daily debt text. And yes, you are out of your mind if you care enough about the math to want to get it. And it tells a very powerful story. So this is what you're going to get every day, a text from me. And we've built a system of grabbing off the Treasury's website and saying, hey, here's what we've borrowed this fiscal year. Here's what we borrowed in the last 365 days. And here's what we're borrowing per second. So, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem, let's see. This is from, I think, yesterday. Yesterday, over the last 365 days, we are borrowing $83,377 million, or excuse me, $83,377 every second. $83,000 a second. And if you do just this fiscal year, and there's some timing effects. Remember, we take in some tax receipts in April. We pay Social Security twice a year, their interest, and that's, can be, $25, $30 billion in interest. But if you do just this fiscal year, $99,480 per second is our borrowing, not spend, borrowing. Please, if you're interested in this, sign up. But you got to understand, and been trying to make the point, the world changed when interest rates started to go up. The world changed over the last couple of years when healthcare costs went up fairly dramatically, and they continue to, and most of that's demographics. We like to pretend, it's things we can control. Unless you have a magic way for baby boomers not to get older, we need to deal with the reality of our demographics. So, Mr. Speaker, Social Security is our #1 spend at $1,450 billion. Interest, gross interest, total interest, this fiscal year is projected to be over $1 trillion, making it the #2 spend in our government. Interest. #3, Medicare. And #4, defense. And a couple of these numbers may actually even go down a bit on things like defense, not Medicare, with some of the budget negotiations that are being finished up right now. But when was the last time you actually had anyone say, hey, did you know defense is actually number 4, not number 2, not number 1. It's number 4 in our spend. Interest is number 2. If I had said that a couple years ago, you would have thought I was out of my mind. How do I get my brothers and sisters here to pay any attention that we're knifing each other? And I just showed you a chart that says over the last 365 days, we're borrowing, I think, $7 billion, $200 million a day. A day. And we've been having fights for months now on things that are, what's $6 billion? That's a lot of money. It's a tremendous amount of money. But understand we're borrowing over $7 billion a day. And just for those who don't like math or charts, we produced a pretty chart where you can see little bars that basically saying, look, here's Social Security. The reason I made this chart is you'll often hear those who are trying to spin you on these numbers, well, we only spent this in interest, and the other interest we paid to ourselves. It's because we borrowed the money. When we reach into the Social Security Trust Fund, when we reach into the Transportation Trust Fund, when we reach into the Medicare Trust Fund, we grab the cash, we spent it, and now we got to pay back that principal and pay interest on it. So that's why you see the difference. But even then, even the net interest looks like it's going to be the second biggest expense in U.S. government this year. That's a stunning numbers. And look, this one's a little hard to read, and I have several charts here that we may go through very quickly because they're awfully technical. But we're just trying to make the point, if you look at this line here, all I'm trying to make the point is we benefited, we lived in a fantasy land for a decade with artificially low interest rates. Realities come home. And we're not intellectually prepared to deal with reality. And that's what this chart is telling you, is when you start to look at this, that's how we're about to have a $1 trillion interest coverage cost this year. So let's actually have a little bit of fun here. In a sort of sadistic way, we hit $34 trillion last week. And a number of members here did their little, social media. It's horrible, it's this and that. Mr. Speaker, if I were to ask our brothers and sisters, how many days before we go from 34 trillion to 35 trillion? Who here? Come on, it's simple math. If you're borrowing about $7.3, $7.4 billion a day, it's about 140 days. In 140 days, you get to rewrite that same social media post. Just remove the 34 and make it 35. And then in 140 days after that, do it again, because there'll be another $1 trillion. We are burning down, and it's not what we often debate behind these microphones. Waste and fraud. Yeah, huge deal. Got to go after it. Foreign aid. Get rid of every dime of foreign aid. It's about 8 days of borrowing. Tax the rich. Great. I'm going to show you, you can get about 1.5 of GDP. Last year, you borrowed 8.4% of the entire economy. Unless we're going to grow up here and start to understand policy. I've done presentation after presentation here showing the biggest thing you could do for America on debt and deficits and on the morality, and I get the crap kicked out of me for telling the truth, is take on obesity. Take on diabetes. Change the cost of health care. Adopt technology to change the cost of government. Be willing to disrupt the business models, the bureaucracy models, this calcification intellectually around here and say, we need to go as fast as we can to adopt things that make us healthier, faster, better, more prosperous, and get up growth going. And instead, the hallways here in Congress are full of people who basically come in, whine at us and say, I need more money. Or don't you dare change things. I don't want to have to compete against that new technology. Between April 20th and May 20th is my best math. We're going to cross that $35 trillion debt threshold. This fiscal year, into September, we could be as high as over $36.2 trillion in borrowing. So for all of those who, mashed their teeth and whined and this, 34, before the fiscal year's over, you're up another $2 trillion. And the speed of this one, I'm being a little bit of a jerk on, but I think it's deserving. We burnt this place down, what was it, last June, a little after that. We did the debt ceiling agreement. We actually got some spending cuts, about $100 billion. Then there's some gains in it for raising the borrowing. And then a little while after that, we removed our speaker. We basically weren't able to do anything for months. What was the debt of the United States? What was our debt when we did that debt ceiling deal? It was $31.8 trillion. Okay. We made a big deal. We got rid of a speaker. We did all these other things. How much progress did we make since then? Come on. A lot of people got television time screaming about this. Well, let's see. We hit 34 last week. Into this April, 35 trillion. Done great, guys. We don't seem to understand 100% of the debt that is growing from today through the next 30 years, and this really makes people uncomfortable. 100% is demographics. It's the interest, it's healthcare costs, and in about 8-9 years, we got to have a brutal, and dear God, please let us grow up and deal with it long before then. In 2033, the Social Security Trust Fund is empty. Our best math is that first year, the shortfall is $616 billion. That's just the shortfall. That's a 25% cut for seniors in 8-9 years. We will double senior poverty. How many people here do you see coming up and saying, we're going to fix that? And then many of the solutions we look at saying, well, just raise the cap. We're going back and triple vetting our numbers. But some of the numbers look like if you just raise the cap and have everyone pay their 12.4% all the way up, no matter what the income is, it may only cover 20, 30% of the shortfall. You got to do all sorts of other taxes. And when you do that, you've taken away your ability to have any optionality for everything else. Once again, we work in a math-free zone. So this chart is the single chart I get the most complaints about. So it must be hitting home. It basically is the chart. And remember, this one's now 2 years old. We just haven't had time to do the update on it. It's only worse today. It was basically saying in 30 years you had $116 trillion of debt. Our new math is closer to $130 trillion if interest rates continue to stay well over 4%. It was basically, this was saying $77 trillion over that 30 years, Medicare. Shortfall, it's healthcare costs, and then the financing of them. And this is over here, $38 trillion is if we backfill Social Security. Okay. How much real work are we doing here? How often do we go home and tell the truth to our constituents? That unless we actually start to act like fiscal adults and take on policy, Major changes in policy to actually, particularly on health care, to change the cost of health care. It's not financing. There's the intellectual vacuousness around here. Obamacare was a financing bill. The AC is a financing bill. Who's got subsidized and who had to pay? Over here, we had our Republican alternative. It was better. It fixed a bunch of the actuarial curve, so hopefully younger people would be willing to participate. But it was a financing bill. Medicare for All is a financing bill. It's not changing what we pay. It was just changing how we pay. You need the adoption of technology, whether it is technology where it's something you can blow into and it prescribes, and that technology exists, except it's illegal, down to actually having the brutal discussion of why are we so sick as a country? So, seriously, particularly for working age, prime age males, life expectancy may be going down again for another year. We're dying. In 18 years, this country has more deaths than births. Remember, our fertility rates last year, I think, fell to 1.64, 1.65. It's math, but there's things we can do. There's ways to make this work. But, dealing with the conversations, well, we just need to raise taxes on rich people. And then you show the charts from their own studies and they just stare at you saying, well, I can't actually say that because that's not what I've been telling my voters. I've offered amendments here this fiscal year to remove every dime we send to entities that have their own taxing authority. Those are brutal amendments. But about 30 to 40% of all non-defense discretionary is money that we borrow and send to cities, states, counties that have their own taxing authority. They'll scream if that passes. But it's intellectually honest. Should we borrow money to send it to entities that have their own taxing authority? Because understand, every dime of defense, every dime of what you think of as government, the FBI, the Supreme Court, my salaries, everything else, it's all borrowed. And it looks like where we're heading right now, which is part of the punchline of tonight's presentation, every dime of defense, every dime of non-defense discretionary, and maybe $300, $400, $500 billion of Medicare will be borrowed this year. Doesn't that send shivers? Am I the only idiot here who actually reads these numbers and then reads them over and goes back again and then goes and has another cup of coffee and goes back and reads them again and goes, my God, why? But yet you talk to the television producers, well, that's not interesting. The public doesn't really care about math. Well, they will when their pensions collapse. This is no longer about your grandkids, your kids. This is about your retirement being screwed over. And just for the intellectual opportunity here, I grabbed and we produced this slide. Okay, United States right now is sitting about 4% in our 10-year. Why? What's going on in the world when Greece has a lower interest rate on their 10-year sovereign debt than we do? Italy's lower than the United States. Portugal's lower. Spain's lower. I mean, the entire Southern Europe average is 3.31. I think that we did this net math as of yesterday. And the United States is around 4. I grew up in a household that actually my father was wonderful teaching me about stock markets and bond markets and those sorts of things. Some kids on Saturday went to the ball field. I went to the stock exchange with my father. It's just what we did. Bond traders and the data they work with are some of the smartest people you can possibly imagine. What's the bond market telling us when the U.S. interest rates on a 10-year note or bond is higher than even Southern Europe? I mean, Greece, come on. When Greece has a better interest rate than we do. What do they know that we don't, or that we're not willing? Actually, I have a different way to phrase it. We know it, we're just not willing to digest it because it's uncomfortable, because it would force us actually to do really hard, difficult stuff. And this place is barely capable of, sorry, I was going to get, no cursing tonight, but we're barely capable of doing our basic job. And then we run like crazy. And look, I've used this chart before. I need it to be steeper, but you got to understand, if we continue to stay well over 4%, we actually have some models here that say, guess what? We're heading to 300% of GDP in debt. What is it? The OECD, and I'm going to show some slides from them, Organization of Economic, whatever. They already have us, if they add up all of our debt, not unfunded liabilities, our current borrow, and they already have us at like 144%. Now, I think we may hit it in the next few weeks, but we'll be at 100% as we score it, as Treasury scores it, 100% of debt to GDP, of publicly held debt in the next few weeks. We finally did it. We did it. Yay, guys. So let's actually, I'm going to go through some of these slides brutally fast. I am so sorry for those trying to keep their fingers going. Take this record. Wave at me if I'm speaking too fast. I've had a lot of coffee. So for my brothers and sisters on the left, I'm going to do 2 or 3 slides to point out something. Did you know that when we did tax reform at the very end of 2017, we actually made the tax system, the income tax system in the United States, more progressive? Wealthy, high-income earners are actually paying a higher percentage of federal income tax today than they did before we did tax reform. How often do you ever hear they come behind the microphone, they give away to the rich, this and that? Oh, come on, clown show. You can read the CBO charts, the joint tax charts, as well as I can. I think you can. Read them. The fact of the matter is top 1% of income earners pay 23.3% of all federal income tax. And that's actually higher than it was before tax reform. I'm going to see if this is an easier way to digest it. The upper income taxpayers finance nearly the entire federal income tax. So if you actually take a look at the top 20% of income earners, and then you go to the second, they only pay 5%, 15%, 5.7, then 2, and then when you get down to the bottom 40% of quartiles, they actually have a negative income tax. We give them money back, the earned income tax credit. And then you start to look at when Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, or even their oligarch tax, they hold these press conferences like, we're going to tax rich people and we're going to solve the problem. Please understand, I'm not defending rich people. I'm defending math. And then you start to see it and you go, well, okay, so the Sanders plan gets us, a $440 billion, except when we actually did this chart, we expected the year's debt to only be 1.8 trillion. It may be 2.8 trillion at the rate we're going right now. But the point here is the theatrics you keep getting of the tax policy don't get you there. So the dirty little secret, what happens a few years from now when the Medicare trust fund's gone, transportation trust fund's gone, Social Security trust fund's about to go? What are we going to do policy-wise? Okay, raise taxes on everyone over $400,000. Okay, you covered a fraction of your problem. We're going to go to a VAT tax. Well, the problem is the VAT tax is crushing to the poor. It's crushing to the working middle class. It's not progressive, but it's really efficient in taking money out of people's pockets. You can do that or do what we've done the last 40 months, which is let inflation go, because inflation, understand, the last 40 months or so, we've actually had one of the, probably the biggest tax hike in modern history, and no one knew they got it. Because when inflation goes up, your savings goes down in its purchasing value, but the U.S. sovereign debt actually is able to be paid back with inflated dollars. Why do you think so many governments, when they get themselves upside down in debt, set off inflation? It's a way to tax you and not even tell you we were doing it. I don't think anyone wants more. Okay. Just to make a point, because this one's always, and I've done this before, and I realize it's like talking to a wall. Income tax revenues have remained relatively constant regardless of the top tax rate. The basic point of this is, what do you get as a percentage of the economy? So let's actually walk through. In the 1950s, you'll every once in a while hear leftists talk about, you had a 90.5% tax rate. Yes, and income taxes produced 7.2% of the economy. But go to the Reagan years, when you got down to, or let's do the 90s, Clinton years. You got down to 36.7% top marginal tax rate. You got 8.1%. Today, we're at 37%. We get 9.2. Anyone see the punchline? Sometimes when you had these incredibly high marginal tax rates, you get this much of the economy. Low marginal tax rate, you get the same amount of the economy. So the secret is dramatically larger economy. You want tax receipts, tax revenues. You got 100 years of data out there showing when we've had very high marginal tax rates, we get the mean. When we got very low, we get the mean. But when we get very low, the pie was getting bigger. When you had very high, the pie was actually getting smaller. Oh. This is just a chart basically saying the same thing I just walked you through. All right. Let's actually go on to something I find fascinating. And I've done this a couple times, but it does not seem to sink in. So anyone that's out there who's, what do you call that? Oh, yeah, literate, and would actually have an interest in reading something that's very well written, but it's simple. Go to Manhattan Institute, Brian Riedel. He has an article from about 5-6 months ago. And what he did is he put together all these academic articles from, and also our joint tax stuff from CBO, from the administration, and put it together and basically said, what would happen if you actually did the Democrats' plan? Great. Take people over 400,000, and remember, purchasing power of 400,000 has dramatically changed over the last 40 months because of inflation, but take everyone that's over 400,000 and maximize their income tax. Maximize their capital gains tax. Maximize their estate tax. Just maximize everything. What could you get? And so I have a series of boards here from the article that basically say, okay, if you did maximize the estate tax, just maximized it before it changed behavior, or just in this case on estate tax, it doesn't change behavior much, but you get 0.1%. So max rate on estate tax, 0.1% of GDP. Great. That got a lot done. Now if you come over here and do some of the others, you also do the corporate tax, you add up, do an increase on the international, do all the Biden corporate tax hikes, do some of the additional garnishment in many ways of the corporate savings. You actually, at the end, you get another 1.5% of the economy in taxes. This will make sense in a moment. And then you go on to, so it's referred to as the maximum sustainable revenue from taxing the rich. And now you sort of walk through everything and then add them all up. And what's the punchline? Well, the punchline comes down to, this as I get my board straight, total amount raw number, you get about 2.1% of the economy in new taxes. You got to now adjust for the economic effects because you just slowed the economy down. Something we don't tell the truth enough about is when we do certain cuts, when we do certain taxes, we do change the size of the economy. So the best math out there is you get about 1.1 to 2% of the economy. That's it. That's the tax the rich plan. You get 1.1 to 2% of the economy. We borrowed 8.4% of the economy last year, and my math right now looks like in this first quarter of this year, we've borrowed 9.6. And look, I get screamed at by staff saying, no one knows what GDP and percentage of GDP is. I'm trying to talk to people like you're adults. The tax side doesn't work. Now, should we change parts of the tax code? Okay, I'm fine with that. But don't think it's the solution. And for my brothers and sisters on my side, I need to put them together. It's a little harder, showing all the discussions of what we think we can cut. And I come up with like a point, maybe a 1.25 of GDP. Now, you got to understand, I'll do a reference so this makes sense. Back last June, when we did the debt ceiling deal, there was $100 billion that was going to be removed from non-defense discretionary. So you're functionally going from $700 billion to $600 some. Bloomberg Analytics, which has really good economists and really good data systems, they spent a fortune building this model, came back and said, yeah, you're going to actually, in 2024, if you execute that, yeah, you're going to save the $100 billion, but you'll also slow down the economy by like 0.5%. Something we actually don't talk about is big boy economics. When they want to raise taxes, and even when we want to cut spending, it does have economic effects. We need to calculate those things in so we're being honest about the math. One last board, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. Yeah, I'm not going to make you all suffer through this. I guess I'm trying to make a point. There's hope. There's a way I can make this work. But we got to do it all together. I mean, we couldn't even organize lunch if we wanted to. There is a way to stabilize the debt to GDP, but it has to be done through policy. Those who look you in the eyes and say, I can cut it and get there, I can tax and get there, they need to own a calculator, and I can give them some great literature to read. But there's policy out there, and policy's hard because you've got to be willing to look a number of the army of lobbyists, many of our constituents, many of the people here, and say, there's a reason you didn't go to Blockbuster Video last weekend. Technology creates revolutions. Instead, now you hit a button at home and you stream. Those changes are already here that could dramatically change the cost of health care, dramatically change the cost of what it is to protect the environment, dramatically change the cost of building transportation. The technology, the engineering is here. But the laws we've passed, the way we reimburse things, we're still defending the old model. If we want to save the country, we have dozens of things that are incredibly important. But I will argue we cannot survive a few more years of every 140 days borrowing another $1 trillion. If you want to understand what takes republics down, it's ultimately when they have to inflate their currency, when they have to crush anyone with savings, destroy your kids' future, your retirement, and that's where we're heading to. There's hope, but every day we sit on our hands here, that hope gets a bit dimmer. Mr. Speaker Pro Tem, with that bit of joy, I'm going to yield back.